All right, and good afternoon. This is Justice for All. I'm George Yates. We're here in our second hour of our show. We just had Jennifer Atkinson, who's an elder law specialist, here on the show. In this next hour, we need to take a little longer look at the Lewis and Clark expedition. Those of us, Lewis and Clark, weren't they the ones that went all the way to the Pacific Northwest and discovered the Lewis and Clark Trail? And it turns out that in the next week, the Lewis and Clark Heritage Days are going to be held in St. Charles, Missouri. And while most of us probably remember a little bit about Lewis and Clark, we've got a guest on here on the show today. Her name is Lisa Roberts, and she's an expert on Lewis and Clark. She's also a children's book author. She's a preschool educator, and she's the author of Back to Basics with Aiden and Addie. And she's with us on the show today. She's going to tell us a little things about this Lewis and Clark expedition that a lot of us don't know, and we'd like to welcome her to the show. How are you doing, Ms. Roberts?
Good afternoon. How are you doing, George?
Well, we're doing great. It's a lovely day here in beautiful Portsmouth, Virginia. We're on K-Talk Radio, 1650 AM. And I read Undaunted Courage a few years back by Stephen Ambrose, I think, who was the author of that book. One of the greatest books I think I've ever read. Incredible book, and it seemed like when you were reading that book, you were just on the trail with Lewis and Clark. Really exciting expedition. What's your favorite thing about that expedition that you like to talk about?
Well, in doing the research with trying to find out facts for my children's book series, this is the second book, and it's Finding Your Inner Adventure and Pioneer Spirit. I really like the relationship between, I would believe, Clark and Sacagawea. He saw her more as an adventurous young lady, that she was smart, and that she wasn't just a savage. So I concentrate on their personal relationships, and it's very complex when you have 38 people that are on this mission to find a path and to do Jefferson's orders. I find the complexity of their relationships fascinating.
Well, the Lewis and Clark expedition got its start with Thomas Jefferson, third president of the United States, and Meriwether Lewis was his personal secretary, wasn't he? And
he was, yes.
And he was the captain, or he's appointed by Jefferson to be the captain.
Yes.
He went and recruited William Clark and made him the co-captain, which was an interesting way of doing things. A lot of people say, how in the world can you have co-captains? But they were co-equal, weren't they, on that expedition?
They were. The Congress did not vote unanimously to make Clark a captain, but you're correct. He shared that title, even though it wasn't official. They did share that together. That is correct.
I recall Meriwether Lewis being an excellent sharpshooter and a hiker, and he was on the land most of the time. And William Clark was out on the boat with poling the boat up the Missouri River, or whatever the rivers they were on. Is that your understanding how all that worked?
Yes, Clark was an excellent map maker, and so he kind of was on that end of the spectrum. And Lewis was, when he was with Jefferson, he made him study for a year and a half botany and astronomy and natural history, and he wanted the Corps of Discovery to be good map makers and to also bring back information on the plants and animals that were in that area.
When they set out on that voyage, they had no idea what they were getting in for. The only mountains that Meriwether Lewis and William Clark had really had any experience with was the Appalachian Mountains, which were nowhere near the size and height of the Rocky Mountains and the Bitterroots. They were really in for a rude awakening when they got out west. And they saw the size of the mountains. It was a much larger task than they had any idea they were getting into.
That is very true. Except I don't know if your listeners know that they both were born in Virginia.
Right.
So they were maybe familiar with your beautiful, I know I would call them, being from Texas, I would call them mountains.
Yeah, and the Blue Ridge Mountains at their height are maybe 6,000 feet, and they're rolling hills, and they're not that they're not that wide, so that you can go up one side and go down the other side in a day or two.
That's right.
And I think that the Lewis and Clark they envisioned that they were just going to climb up these mountains, and then they were just going to hike up there with their boats, and then they were going to slide down the river and be at the Pacific Ocean. And they realized that when they got to the Bitterroots, and they really did need Sacagawea, didn't they, to get through those mountains?
They did. I think they were very naive, and thank goodness they had her. Not only when she was kidnapped at a very young age and taken to the east, she still remembered the West, and she was able to recognize landmarks to get them places. But she was a great interpreter. She knew several native languages and helped them in negotiations with horses and food and supplies that they needed. So, and she was also seen as a peaceful symbol because Indians did not travel with women and children if they were in a war party. So they considered these strange-looking white men peaceful because of her and the baby.
Well, tell me, how in the world did the Lewis and Clark expedition, in my understanding, made it all the way to the Pacific Ocean and back without a casualty? Is that true? Was anyone lost along the way through battle or murder or Indian fighting or anything like that? Did anyone? There were no casualties.
They had a couple of scuffles, but no one was killed by gunshot. I know that Lewis had some buckshot in his bottom, but he figures that it was one of his men that just took misaim. But the only one that they lost was one of the gentlemen who had appendicitis attack, but no one was lost due to gunfire.
Okay, so someone did die from medical reasons.
Correct. One person, yes.
Now, and I recall, didn't they brought a slave? Didn't one of them have a slave he brought along?
Yes, Clark. He brought York.
Right.
And he was his slave. And he and Sacagawea, when they ended up being in where the Columbia River, and they were trying to decide what side of the river they were going to make the fort, and they were able to vote. And it was the first vote recorded from a native woman and from a slave. They got to vote in where they were going to make this camp for the winter once they reached the Pacific.
Now, that was when they were in Seaside, Oregon.
Correct. It was, they named it Fort Clatsop.
Right.
And it was near Astoria, Oregon. You're correct, yes.
Yeah, I've been there. That's where 101 crosses over there, across the Columbia River, and as soon as you cross over into Oregon, Fort Clatsop's on the Oregon side, right?
Correct. Yes, it's beautiful.
Well, it wasn't beautiful for them. When I read Undaunted Courage, it was just a gnarly, rainy, miserable winter. It was the rainiest, coldest. They couldn't believe it. They were all headed. They were ready to go back to Virginia. They were done with the Pacific Northwest.
They were. I think they had it with all the cold, and there were some times that they were very hungry and they had to eat things they really did not want to eat, and that was upsetting to them, and they suffered from maladies of the stomach due to that. And can you imagine how that was during that time, cold and wet and sick?
Well, now this is Justice for All. I'm George Yates, and we're with Lisa Roberts. You're a former preschool teacher, and you, I guess somewhere along the way, decided to start writing books. And so you're writing books full-time, or are you still teaching children too?
I have grandchildren, so yes, I'm always teaching in some way or another. But I also ran private schools for 12 years, and then the last 8 years, I decided to start another business. And when you said that you had an elder law attorney on, I run an elder care business. So I went from children to the elderly. But I do write books late at night, and I'm enjoying the process.
So your book series is called Back to Basics with Aiden and Addie. Tell us about it.
It is a 29-book series, and it's my mission to get parents and children back to the basics of America's founding values. The first book, it was on Lincoln and leadership, And the children travel across America on Lincoln's train, the Leviathan 63. And he's kind of a spirit mentor, and he talks them through the country, and as they meet these historic figures at each stop. And the second one, of course, is Sacagawea and Lewis and Clark, and they end up having interesting conversations and adventures that happen on this trip with other children. And the third book's on patriotism with President Washington. And then I also have one on equal rights and liberty and justice with Martin Luther King and Patrick Henry. And the list goes on.
Well, now, the history of the American West is of a lot of conflict, Indian wars, and yet these gentlemen crossed over the entire continent, encountered Indians all along the way, and certainly with Sacagawea, who, how was it that they avoided conflict with Indians, in your opinion, based upon your research, when later settlers basically got scalped?
It was especially due to Sacagawea, in my opinion, because she was so good at negotiating. And plus, one of the tribes they ran across, she ended up being he was a long-lost brother, the chief of that tribe. And she was able to keep them balanced and quiet during negotiations. They followed her lead. And Lewis and Clark were really there to make a presence, but they weren't there to change anything. It was live and let live. And they were bringing peace, and they weren't trying to change and tell them where they were going to live, what they were going to do. And it seemed to change as they went back and they started moving out west. I believe, in my opinion, in doing the research, that's where it stood. Because
they weren't really homesteading. They weren't trying to drive the Indians out of their land. They were just passing through, so they weren't a threat like the later white settlers were to become.
Exactly, and they were fascinated with everything that they brought, and they were fascinated with the innovation of what they saw, and they were also fascinated with York, the way he looked, and
they'd never seen white people or black people.
That's right.
So they went, wow, these people are and York was the only black on the expedition.
Yes, especially the really dark colored. Yes,
right.
They were fascinating by him. Fascinated.
Well, how old was Sacagawea? Tell us about her a little bit.
Was she was 15 or 16. Historians will have her age from 15 to 19, just depending on what you read and who is telling the story. But how I like to establish her in the story is she was brave, she was curious, she had to be extremely brave to be pregnant at the time and then give birth to John Baptiste on the expedition.
Who was the father of her child?
It was a French gentleman that ended up buying her from some of the natives that ended up taking her when she was a child. And he also went on the expedition, but they don't say much of him in their journals. Not at all. They don't say anything about his negotiating skills. They do talk. Lewis will talk about her as in the savage type person, but Clark spoke nicely about her and was in awe of her bravery. And as a matter of fact, she even saved some of Lewis's journals from a boat mishap. So she was always looking out for the expedition, and he really appreciated that. And he said that in his journal.
And what sort of negotiating did she do on their behalf?
Well, when they didn't have any more horses, either the horses ran away or some died due to illness, she would negotiate horses for them to make it across the Rockies, and she also for food and for medicines. She was a good negotiator because, of course, knew their languages.
And so what did they use to pay for these horses when they negotiate? What legal tender did the expedition have to buy horses?
Well, they had their they weren't really interested in the money, but they were interested in their supplies. And with their supplies, they had arms, and they had trinkets and items that they had never seen from the West. And that's what they used.
I recall in my reading of Undaunted Courage that they would buy these horses, use these horses up, and they were killing them and eating them for food when they got into the cold tops of the Bitterroot Mountains.
They did, and they also they got this from some of the Indian tribes. They were eating the wild dogs that were following the tribe,
right?
But they never ate Lewis's dog. He had a dog with him, and his name was Seaman. And they never did eat him, but
No.
they did eat other dogs. That is correct. And that's one of the things they did not like doing.
They didn't mind eating horses, but they didn't want to eat dogs.
Correct.
But they were starving. I mean, they had to.
That's right. That's exactly right. When they couldn't trap and kill things, they had to eat what was available, and that's what they did, yes.
Well, describe the meeting of Lewis and Clark and Sacagawea. How in the world did they meet up in the first place?
Well, they were at Fort Mandan, and she was there with her husband.
And where's Fort Mandan? What state? What state is that now? Is it Montana?
It is. No, they say that it's around the North Dakota area.
North Dakota, right? Okay.
Yes, and that was the area, the dropping off spot before they hit the wilderness. And she was there, and that's when they found out that she could speak different languages. And just were in these talks when they were eating and drinking at the fort, and asked her if she would do this, and her husband, and they said yes. I think she had that pioneer spirit in her at the time. In fact, some historians were saying that she might have even thought that she would meet and see her family again, which she did. She ended up seeing her brother again.
So she was recruited by them at
Yes.
Fort Mandan to join the expedition. Did they offer to pay her?
No, they were not paid.
It was
She
just
not paid.
just for the fun to go with them, and so did she go? She went all the way to the Pacific and then returned, and then did they drop her back off in North Dakota on the way home, or did she stop?
They did.
Okay, and she
Yes, she stopped at the fort. As a matter of fact, history's kind of sketchy on when she passed. They're thinking that she died when she was 24, and Clark ended up kind of adopting her two children. She had a little girl after she had John Baptiste, and her name was Lisette, and he ended up schooling them.
Well, tell us a little bit. Let's get some background here. If you've just joined us, I'm with Lisa Roberts. She's an expert on the Lewis and Clark expedition, which is one of the most fascinating adventures in all of American history. The background of the Lewis and Clark expedition is pretty well known. I mean, Thomas Jefferson, as president, bought the whole territory, I guess, of Louisiana from the French. But what the Louisiana Purchase did not cover this entire area. It was just part of it, wasn't it? And we had just a lot of the areas that they went through were not even really American territory, right?
That's correct. As a matter of fact, some of the Spanish got wind that Lewis and Clark were going to take this expedition, and they did not want them in that northern area where the Spanish had, and that would be around the Montana area. And they were going to arrest him, and they ended up showing up a day and a half later when Lewis and them had already left.
Yeah, it was somewhat of a audacious, bold move by the American president to say, we're just going to go ahead and just, it was sort of all part of that American manifest destiny. We're here and we're going to take over this whole continent, whether the Spanish or the English or French want it. It's ours for the taking, and we're taking it. And you got to give Jefferson a lot of credit for that kind of vision. So just let me get started here. Meriwether Lewis is the secretary to Jefferson. Jefferson
Correct.
says, I need to get this expedition going. I want you to be the captain. And then he says, okay, Mr. President, I'll get started. What does he do? Where do they start? He recruits Clark. Tell us the path of the Lewis and Clark expedition in the next minute or two or so. Just kind of give us the summary. Where did they start? Where did they end up?
Sure. They started in near St. Charles, Missouri, and they waited about 10 days for Lewis to get there, and a lot of the men kind of got in trouble because they liked to drink, and they were acting up, and of course Clark, being an Army disposition, would discipline them with lashes and get everybody in order, and then Lewis shows up, and they leave to St. Louis, and that's when they take off, and they have to camp at Fort Mandan, that is near North Dakota now, for the winter because it's just too cold to
So
set out.
how do they get from the St. Charles, Missouri to North Dakota?
Oh, they had all kinds of boats and things that they built, and a lot of times when they would run into waters that they could not navigate, they had to stop that and then walk and take horses from there.
And what would they do with the boats? Would they leave the boat behind and get another boat when they had to go back into the water? Would they carry the boat? What did they do?
It's a mixture of both. They had materials that they would build these boats with, and some they would leave behind. They honestly thought they were going to be able to navigate the entire time, but they were not able to do so, and finding out kind of frustrated them. But they were able to gather supplies at the fort, and clothing and medicine, and keep the arms, but they always kept building supplies with them.
So it's St. Charles, Missouri is I see that's going to be Lewis and Clark Heritage Days next week in St. Charles, Missouri. Is that when they took off at May 5th? I see May 15th and 16th. Is that when the voyage began?
Yes. It started May of 1804 and then ended September 1806. So
it was a 2-year expedition to Seaside, Oregon, and back from St. Charles, Missouri. So what river is there in St. Charles? Is that the Missouri River?
Yes.
And did they stay pretty much? Did they pretty much follow the Missouri all the way to Montana?
They did. It was
It's a long river, isn't it? It goes all the way up and through North Dakota and across Montana.
It does. It goes through Great Falls. And then they had, as a matter of fact, when they went up to the Great Falls, there was one of the Indian tribes told them to follow the one with the huge waterfall that would get them over the Rockies and to the Pacific. And they ran into a fork, and that river was the Marias River. And they ended up saying, well, what river are we going to take? So Clark stayed there with part of the expedition, and Lewis went off with 4 or 5, and they were gone for 4 days and found the falls, and they were glad, and they came back, and then they all went over, and that's when they had the really hard time of getting equipment and supplies over the Rockies at that time.
We're going to take a short break here in just a little bit. We're here with Lisa, who is Lisa Roberts, who's author of a series of children's book Back to Basics with Aiden and Addie, and she's we're discussing the Lewis and Clark expedition. So we'll take a little break. We'll come back for the next 30 minutes with Lisa Roberts. But this is a fascinating story how you go all the way. Now, just before the break, I just want to mention that when they're going up this river. It's upriver. They're going against the current all the way with these boats. And that just has to be, and they're actually they're poling their way up in these boats. It's quite an expedition. We'll be right back with Lisa Roberts and more on the Lewis and Clark expedition. We'll be right back.
Good Italian food, daily specials, and a place people enjoy is Spaghetti Eddie's. Indulge in your mouth-watering pizza, pasta, subs, salads, appetizers, and desserts. Open 7 days a week. Log on to SpaghettiEddiesPizzaCafe.com and visit them at Taylor Road and on Eden Way North in Chesapeake for lunch and dinner. Like them on Facebook. Italian food you can count on is at Spaghetti Eddie's.
We talk about it all the time on the show. Are you safe and secure online? Are you private? Leo Laporte here, the tech guy. Well, I've always said if you're on the internet, you're in public, but there are things you can do to protect yourself a little bit. You certainly should know what the risks are. We talk about that each and every week, plus all the latest news, gossip, and tech support. It's coming up this weekend right here with me, Leo Laporte, the tech guy.
Saturdays 8 p.m., Sundays 6 p.m. on K-Talk 1650.
Our RM Designs T-shirt printing and more is located in Smithfield, but serves all of Hampton Roads. They specialize in vinyl design shirts, apparel, window stickers, cups, and other specialty gifts. They also have rhinestone and embroidery designed apparel, and they offer Pandora-style beads and hardware to create a one-of-a-kind piece of jewelry. RM Designs T-shirt printing and more caters to businesses, sports teams, churches, groups, and family reunions. They also offer a great fundraising package should you be in need of money for a special project. And they also do home parties if you and your friends would like to get together and make your own creations. RM Designs T-shirt printing and more can be reached at 757-255-9140. That's 757-255-9140. Email them at rmdesigns11@aol.com or find them on Facebook at RM Twisted Designs. You can also place orders directly off their store at storeenvy.com/RM Twisted Designs.
Hi, this is Greg Bigoveris. Join me for Sports Scene each Wednesday from noon to 1 right here on News Talk 1650 WHKT. You can also hear the show on TuneIn as well. We will talk to local, regional, and nationally acclaimed sports guests, and we'll interact with our audience as well at Greg Bick on Twitter. Sports Scene, Wednesdays from noon to 1 right here on 1650 AM.
Are you prepared to defend yourself and your family against any threat? Veteran-owned and operated One Shot Trading Post is ready to make sure that you are. Continuing training and classes on defense, survival, and weapons. Full gunsmithing services, special orders and financing available with military discounts. $15 transfers, and One Shot Trading Post is always looking to buy, sell, or trade. Located at 4366 Holland Road at South Plaza Trail, make sure that you're ready for anything at One Shot Trading Post. 463-5893, OneShotTradingPost.com.
Okay, we're back. I'm George Yates. This is Justice for All, and I'm with Lisa Roberts, and we're talking about the Lewis and Clark expedition. You were mentioning earlier they kept extensive journals, both Lewis and Clark, and were instructed by the president to catalog everything, really, the rivers they crossed and the trees and the plants and the animals and everything. How much of those journals have survived to the present day?
Well, all the plants and the animals, there was 179 species of plants and trees that he gathered information on, and 122 species of animals and birds and fish, and information about 48 tribes that we did not even know existed. And most of that information did survive because of the journals and his notes. But a lot of the samples and examples that he brought back were lost, half of them, from Washington to Richmond. Jefferson had wanted to send them to Richmond, and in a 100-mile trek, a boat capsized, and half of that information was lost. But they were able to save the information that was written, so that part is good.
Yeah, wasn't Lewis instructed after the voyage or expedition to, I guess he holed up somewhere in Missouri or somewhere to write his, or
yes,
but in the meantime, all of the things that they'd named got renamed by other people.
Yes, and he got into some arguments with some publishers about that, as a gentleman that was on the expedition tried to beat him to the punch, and he wrote to the publisher and said, please wait, because we're the ones who really know this information very well, and it's factual. And he got into some squabbles about that, but it ended up coming out later, and they ended up getting credit for it a long time later.
Yeah, because he took such a long... It was years before Lewis finally got around to publishing his journals. How come it took so long?
I think because Jefferson gave him the to be governor of the new territory, and then they were saying, historians were saying, that he was just in a depression. They were talking like he was an individual who struggled with his moods, and they were thinking that had a lot to do with it as well.
Right. So tell us about Meriwether Lewis. What was he like as a person? Why did Jefferson choose him?
Well, they were longtime friends, and he was his personal assistant. And he was a quick study, and he knew that he would be able to write and discover, and he was steadfast in what he would do on this journey. And I think that's why he chose him. He was a natural. Mary Lewis Weather's mama was a naturalist, and she was someone who would use herbs to heal. And so he came from that naturally. And Jefferson saw that in him and wanted to develop that in him believed in him.
How old was he when he set out on this journey in 1804?
He was 35 when he died, and that was in 1809. So he was in his early 30s.
Right. And he had been Jefferson's personal secretary for, a couple of years, I guess, prior to that?
Yes, for about 2 years.
How did he meet Jefferson in the first place?
And what I gathered that it was a family. He was from a family that was in the Revolutionary War, and it was family acquaintance, and that's how they knew him. His family was had a lot of awards during that in that war, and they were courageous. And I gathered that that's how he met him, is through family.
35 is a bit of an untimely death, even for that era. What did he die of?
Well, he died of 2 gunshot wounds, and there are some individuals that think they say some that he committed suicide, and some say that it was that he was murdered, that he knew things maybe he shouldn't, and that he was murdered. So it's really up in the air. In my opinion, for an individual to be that strong mentally and physically to go through what he did going on this expedition, I just don't see him taking his life.
And Jefferson rewarded him with the governorship of the Missouri Territory, or what was the reward?
Correct. He was governor of the new territory, and Clark was the governor of Indian Affairs. And which is kind of ironic is that Clark was above him when they were in the Army in their younger years, and then as it turns out, Lewis ends up being over him in their later years.
Tell us about Clark. How was it that Meriwether Lewis, because it was his choice, right, to select Clark as his co-captain? How did he choose Clark? And tell us about what you know about William Clark.
Well, William Clark was also from a family that was in the Revolutionary War, and he had a couple of brothers that were, one was a brigadier general and the other was a general. And he had the family, he did not have the formal education that Lewis had, but he was a natural scout. He was really good at making maps, and he paid attention to detail. And they met in the Army. Of course, he was his leader in the faction that they were in. So and Lewis really respected him. And he's the first person he thought of when Jefferson said, "Would you take on this expedition?"
And after he got back, now they both kept their own individual journals on the expedition. What was the Jefferson rewarded him with director of Indian Affairs, you say, and
yes.
What did he do with the rest of his life after the expedition?
Well, it was a conflicting life. He in one hand, he really understood the plight of the Indians, their culture, but he followed the law. When Andrew Jackson told him, yes, you will take out this tribe, they're not abiding by treaties, he was trying to be the peacemaker, and he found himself in conflict the entire time. That he was put into this position where he had to follow the law.
And because Jackson was quite the Indian fighter.
Yes.
He was. If not an Indian, genocide type individual.
Well, that is true. He sent him out when he would say, take them out, that he would take them out.
Didn't Jackson?
Even though he would try to.
But those were in later years, wasn't it? I mean, if we're talking Jackson, that's many, many years later, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
We're talking Trail of Tears type stuff. I mean, we're talking Cherokee Nation and all of that. I mean, so Clark must have lived quite a bit longer than Lewis.
He did. He didn't pass until he was 68.
Mm-hmm.
He did, and that was of natural causes. So there wasn't anything under conspiracy as it was with Lewis.
So what is the ultimately the Lewis and Clark expedition was from 1804 to 1806, September, a little bit more than 2 years.
Yes.
When was the next expedition? I mean, that just blazed the trail, didn't it, for a whole, I guess, generation of whole generations of people following that trail out west. Did that become the main trail out west, or did it just become one of many?
It did become the main trail initially, and then they found that at the Marias River that they could go over a easier path that would go to the Columbia, where the Columbia let out, and then over to the Pacific. So they ended up finding that there were easier routes, but it did blaze that trail, and Jefferson did want the expedition to kind of stake their claim in that area, and it did work. They just started going out further and further, and more started going out west. As a matter of fact, a lot of the Indian nations, in 2004, there was an Indian nation that was at St. Charles when they were doing the Heritage Days that was saying that they blamed the Lewis and Clark expedition for the genocide of the Indian nations. So they were having lots of discussions about the justice of it all at that time. So it's even today.
Well, ultimately, the whole westward expansion of the white settlers into the West were responsible. So you got to figure that Lewis and Clark were the first. So it stands to reason that's true.
That is. I've often thought about that. I think they were very naive in wanting to do this. They were explorers. Their personalities were, mentally they were, and I think they wanted the expansion, but I don't think they were looking for exploitation.
Well, and that wasn't their job, and they had they didn't have any political. This was nothing more than an expedition to get to the Pacific Ocean, find the path,
Correct.
Come back, report back to the president. What happened afterwards was nothing that they could involve themselves in. They couldn't start making moral judgments, and they had no way of knowing that there was not going to be any peaceful cooperation between settlers. And of course, the Indian way of living was so completely different than what the white settlers to follow. It was just a clash of cultures that was just never going to reconcile. So how many, when they got to the top of the Missouri River, the Missouri Breaks, is that what they call it? Or wherever they got to the Messiah Falls, how many days was it by land through the mountains before they were able to, put a boat down in the Columbia and start riding it to the ocean?
It was a month.
A month?
Yes. It took them over a month to do this.
And it was at what time of year was that?
And that was in the late spring, because by the time they got to the mouth, it was starting to get fall. And early summer when they first started that. They knew that they couldn't get out because they had some more discoveries and more exploration to do in that area, that they wouldn't be able to get out before winter set in.
So what did they? So they just settled somewhere and waited for winter, and then started out across the mountains in the early spring or late
Correct.
Spring.
Yes, and they were really good at knowing when certain things were going to happen. And they did not know that the winter, when they settled in there on the Columbia River, that it was going to be that bad of a winter. And
you mean when they got to the coast, or when they were coming out of the mountains?
When they got to the coast, when they were coming out of the mountains, they did hit some bad weather, but it wasn't as bad as when they were on the Columbia. It was just so cold and rigid for them.
Right. Now, did they carry boats with them during that month, or did they build boats when they got to the other side?
They built boats when they got to the other side, but they had some shell material that they did carry along with them that they never left behind.
And so, where does this 30-day voyage or expedition begin and end on a modern map? If we're going to try to look at it.
Well, on a modern map, you would start at St. Louis and go through the state of Missouri, in between Nebraska and Iowa, up through the middle of South Dakota, and through west North Dakota, Montana, and the upper regions of Montana, then Idaho, and then through Washington and Oregon, where Portland, Oregon is today, and then out the mouth of the Pacific right there.
And this 30-day expedition through the mountains, where does that begin on a modern map, and where does it end? Where do they build boats and connect with the Columbia River?
That was in Idaho and Oregon area. And then when they would, where the river split right there, where they would go through the Rockies and then out to the Pacific.
Well, it must have been quite a sleigh ride then once they got to the other side of the Bitterroots or wherever, the mountain range, because for the first time they're actually on a river and they're going with the current.
That's true. That is true. And they did, Clark did make some mention of that in his journal, that it was a little bit easier going back. They had an easier time going back.
Yes, if you've just joined us, I'm George Yates, and this is Justice for All, and we've spent the last 45 minutes or so with Lisa Roberts, who's a children's book writer and a preschool educator and expert on the Lewis and Clark expedition. Yeah, I mean, I've made that drive a number of times along that Columbia River. You go up Highway 15, it turns into Interstate 84, and it runs all the way along the south bank of the Columbia River, and you can ride for hours. You can see Mount Hood way off in the distance. You know, that whole beautiful day. You can spend the whole day driving west and see the 11,000-foot peak of Mount Hood on a sunny day. I would guess that if they're in the late spring and they're riding down that Columbia River headed towards the Pacific Ocean, that must have been one hell of a sight for them to be looking up at the Mount Hood off in the distance. It's several days away, of course, by river. Right. That must have just been like the end of a dream, seeing, wait a minute, look what we've got ahead of us. You know, we're riding with the current, and there's this pretty mountain right there, bigger than anything they'd ever seen. They
did make mention of things that they saw and how beautiful the falls were and the water was and how clear it was. And they did make mention of the plants that they saw, the animals. They were in awe. It wasn't all fearful, where they would just fear Indians every day or fear sickness. There were some really nice moments of when they would find different plants and animals that they had never seen before. That, I think they cherished those moments.
But they, you know, there's some really nice wineries along in there, and they didn't have any of those back in those days. It's too bad that they, you know, now if they were to be doing it, they could pull over and get themselves a nice little, you know, Pinot Grigio, I suppose, with their meal, and it wasn't available to them, I guess, at that time. But it was. So what time of year are they going down the Columbia, headed towards the Seaside, Oregon?
That was the late summer, early fall that they were doing this.
Oh, that's a perfect time of year to be in Oregon and Washington.
It's beautiful,
right.
So pretty.
Right. So, I mean, I'm from Washington State. I went to college and high school up in the islands of Washington State, so I'm real familiar with the area. My brother lives in Oregon City, which a lot of people try to say, well, that's the end of the Oregon Trail, but it really isn't. I mean, why would Oregon City claim to be the end of the Oregon Trail? They got a museum there. There's a cliff and a waterfall and stuff, and why would they call Oregon City the end of the trail if, in fact, they went all the way to Seaside? I don't understand why they.
I don't understand that either.
But Oregon City likes to say, "Oh, well, this is the end of the Lewis and Clark Trail." So I said, "Wait a minute, no, it's not. They went all the way to the coast." I
think they all kind of like to claim things like this.
Yeah, anything for tourism. You know, anything to get people to come and buy trinkets or get them to come to your town. So
That
how
is
long?
true.
So did they spend the entire winter there along the coast on
did.
Seaside? And they got there
Yes.
in September or October, I suppose,
Yes.
of
They did spend it.
1805. Would that be 1805?
1805, yes, because they didn't return until September of 1806.
So they
And-
spent the winter. When did they start the trek back from the coast?
I'm trying to remember. I know that was early spring that they did that.
Of 1806.
Yes,
And
of
then
1806.
Well, now, how did they make it back in such a shorter period of time? If it took them all the way from 1804.
Well, they followed the trek back from on the upper parts of Montana, and they did not. And even Lewis will state this in some of his journals writings. He would state that they didn't have as much fear and trouble with the tribes that they passed because they'd already done that, and they would only stop for supplies and things. They didn't have to look and watch and wait, so they could just move on. And the Indians left them alone for the most part.
How did they get back up? Did they go back up the Columbia in boats, or did they go overland? I mean, that's that's a fast flowing river.
It is. They did part way with the boat, and then they got out and they would do a lot of the trekking just around the river.
Right.
And when it was treacherous, they would get out.
And then going through the mountains was probably a shorter trip
Yes.
of going back because they knew the way. And then
Correct.
once they got to the Missouri, it was all down river.
Downhill from there.
Right. And so they could just basically took boats all the way back to St. Charles, Missouri.
Yes. Well, to St. Louis, yes.
I'm sorry, St. Louis. So where do they consider to be the end of the expedition when they returned? Right from where they started in Missouri, where the celebration is next week?
They did, and they brought the materials through St. Louis and then Kentucky and Cincinnati and Pittsburgh and then over to Washington, D.C., but that they stopped. They consider stopping point St. Louis.
Mm-hmm. Are you going to go to this little celebration next week yourself?
I would love to. I just got back from President Lincoln's 150 commemorative funeral in his hometown, Springfield, Illinois. So I don't know if I'll be able to make the
Right.
one in St. Louis, but I would love to. I want to go up there.
So what's your most, if you've just joined us, I'm with Lisa Roberts, and she's, how many books have you written in this series? What's it called again?
It's Back to Basics with Aiden and Addie, and there's 29 books in the series, and it's just trying to get children back to America's founding values through seeing that the historic figures were real people with trials and tribulations and bad moods and temperaments.
And what grades? I have a 4-year-old. Actually, I'm having a birthday party for her today.
Happy birthday.
Yes. So what ages? Why don't we do a little plug for your book right here in the last 5 minutes? How do we? We're here with Lisa Roberts. Give us your website or your, how do people find your books if they want to get
Sure.
this history for their children?
Sure. The age group is 8 to 12, and I love hearing from children. I'd like to know their opinions on leadership and if they think they're a pioneer and what they want to do with their lives. And they can find me on www.aidenandaddie.com. That's aidenandaddie.com.
That's AYDAN
Yes,
and
sir.
Addie, ADDY.com, aidenandaddie.com. Okay.
And you can buy the books on there. I have a moral compass that's coming out that the children might like. And then Amazon.com, they can, of course, purchase the books there as well.
And you've got 29 of these books.
Yes, sir. I've just started a new campaign called the Grandparenting with History, and trying to get grandparents in the area to tell me their stories of who their favorite historic figures are and why. And it's a great opportunity to start conversations with their grandbabies.
And since we've been talking about the Lewis and Clark expedition so much, is there anything about the Lewis and Clark expedition that we've been talking an hour? I'm sure there's something you'd like to say about it that I haven't mentioned or asked you about. What is it about it that's the most salient feature to you that you think is the coolest thing about it that maybe we haven't discussed?
The coolest thing is just their tenacity to finding a new way. It was a frontier that was not known. Of course, they were fearful, but yet they had that burning in the belly, as my daddy used to say, to go out and be brave and come back with new studies and an enlightenment of a new era. Sacagawea really surprised me. I don't know if your listeners know, but she has 23 statues of her, and there's more statues in her honor than any other American woman.
Is that right? And where are
Yes.
these statues? I mean, they're all over the country or all over?
They are.
Isn't that something?
She has 2 lakes named after her and 4 mountains and a river, and she was just
They couldn't have done.
fascinating to be so
They
young.
really would not have made it without her, would they?
No,
I mean
they would
that,
not have.
She was so important to them because she was the interpreter, and she was the one that got them those horses. They would have died in
Right.
those mountains without her.
They would have, and I believe that Lewis knew that. I mean, not Lewis. Clark knew that more than Lewis did.
What kind of reward did she get when she was back? Did the president ever do it? Jefferson ever
No.
give her any? Isn't that
No.
something to have done that much for American history, and still be rewarded with 23 statues? But she didn't get a governorship of anything, did she?
No, she sure did not.
But what a legacy!
Yes, what a legacy. I agree.
Well, that's been fascinating. Well, thank you, Lisa, for coming on the show, and it's
You're
been really
so
fun.
You're so welcome. And I wanted to ask you, if I may, how is your sweet daddy?
How is my sweet daddy?
Yes.
Well, he's 91 years old, and he'll be 92 in December, and he's going to be coming over to my daughter's birthday party tonight. So I'll tell him you asked about him.
Good. I listened to your show with him, and it brought tears to my eyes. What a fascinating man.
Yeah, I think I'll probably have him on for this year's Father's Day again.
That I would listen. That's great.
Well, great. Well, then that's great. Well, listen, that's Lisa Roberts, and so great to have you. And
Thank
we'll talk again, hopefully.
Thank you so much, and tell your daughter happy birthday.
I will. Thank you. And so
Thank
that's
you.
So that's the end of our show today. That's George Yates here, Justice for All. It was Lisa Roberts. That was great. She asked about my dad. I think we will probably have him again for Father's Day this year. That'll be in next month. So, all right. Well, listen, I hope you all have a great day out there. It's a lovely day. I think the sun is still out, so I'm going to head on out of the studio. And this is Justice for All. Please join us again next week. We have the guest from the Marshall Project next week, which is a fascinating group of folks that deal with current issues in the law. So join us again next week for Justice for All between 2 and 4. I'm George Yates. Have a great day.